Hi, this is Delia from Delia Creates. Today we are going to make a ribbed, reversible two-tone beanie. You'll need wool or acrylic blend DK or Category 3 yarn in 2 colors, about 60 grams or 185 yards of each, and preferably rolled into cakes to make switching between colors easier. A 5mm hook, scissors, and yarn needle. To begin, chain 51 with your first color. Now in the second chain from the hook, we are going to half double slip stitch. To half double slip stitch, yarn over, insert your hook, yarn over, pull through the stitch, then pull through both loops on your hook. Okay, let's do it again. Yarn over, insert your hook, yarn over, pull through the stitch, and then straight through both loops on your hook. It helps to take it one loop at a time. After you pull through the stitch, it helps to pull the loop up a bit, like this, before pulling through the remaining loops to get the tension right. I highly recommend making a gauge swatch first to get a feel for the tension of this stitch, because it can be tricky. You want it to be neat and tidy, but not too snug. Continue working half double slip stitches. When you reach the end of your row, it's time to switch colors. Lay the new yarn over the hook, leaving a 4-inch tail, and pull through the loop on your hook. Pull on the first color and second color to tighten the new loop, then turn and chain 1 with the second color. Work a half double slip stitch into the third loop of the first stitch and under the first color yarn. The first few stitches will be squirrely, especially for this first color change. It's really important to work not in these top 2 loops, but in the third loop underneath the top 2 loops to create the right texture, right there. Once you've worked a few stitches, pull on the tail of the second color to clean up the end. Continue working half double slip stitches in the second color, encasing the first color in your stitches as you go. When you get to the end of the row, make sure the count is correct. For the last stitch only, instead of working in the third loop, half double slip stitch in between the last stitch and the starting chain. Total stitch count is 50, not including the starting chain 1. If you turn your work over, it will look like a mess. This is because you're crocheting over the strand of the first color. Pull on that strand and you'll see everything tidy up. Between rows, untangle the 2 strands before they get too bad. Then switch colors, turn first, or do this before you turn, either way works. Chain 1 with the first color, then pull on the second color to sort of lock the new color in place. Chain 1 with the first color again to start the new row. You'll half double slip stitch into the third loop of the first stitch just like before. It can be a little bit tight though, so it takes some finagling for this first stitch. Again, make sure you are working under the third loop and the strand of the other color. Continue working half double slip stitch with the first color, encasing the second color as you go. At the end of each row, do a quick count to ensure you'll have 50. It's easy to miss a stitch at the end and work 1 when 2 are needed, especially after you've worked a few rows. See how the stitch gets scrunched up at the end and is a little tight? The beginnings and endings of each row sometimes take extra finesse. Be sure to pull the encased yarn tightly, even too tightly, and then stretch out the rows so everything lays flat and even. Then repeat the process row after row for 114 rows. As you work more rows, here are 4 important things to keep in mind. First, one of the sides will become the top of the brim, so there are 2 things you need to do to keep it looking straight and tidy. 1, always work in the last stitch the same way each time. This is where I work through the same side loops. However you decide to do it, just be consistent. And 2, at the end of each row before switching colors, pull the encased yarn color tightly, then stretch the last few rows out as far as you can. This will make the top look wider than needed, but it will even out eventually. If you don't do this, the rows will start to cinch inward, and you can't fix it with blocking later because of the other color you were crocheting over in each row. So pull and stretch after each row. Speaking of, second, how you crochet over the other strand of yarn matters for making each row look tidy. The strand of color not being used needs to lay on top and in front of the strand of color that is being used. So that you can see why this is important, let's see what happens when we crochet around the non-working strand behind the working yarn instead of in front. It starts off looking not much differently, but then you flip over the row, pull on the non-working yarn to clean things up, and you can see the wrong color is on top compared to the neighboring stitches. Again, this doesn't seem that obvious, but it does impact how easy the third loop is to access in the next row. And it sort of ruins the crisp lines of colors, as you can see here. I noticed my mistakes after I had worked these rows. It wasn't worth it to me to go back and frog it, but it does weaken the two-tone effect a little, so be mindful of strand placement. Third, crocheting over the opposing strand makes it vulnerable to warping, so every few rows stretching the entire rectangle helps it stay square and straight. Fourth and lastly, because the third loop of the first stitch in each row is so tight, I found it helpful to tease it out with the tips of my scissors before completing that stitch. I put this project in a zip top pouch and took it with me everywhere, sneaking in a few rows here and there. You have to go slowly to get the tension right, so it's a good pick up and put down kind of project. I'd say it took me about a month. Again, work a total of 114 rows or whatever amount you need, just be sure you end with the second color. Flip the rectangle so that the first color dominant side is facing up, then fold it in half lengthwise. Give it a stretch to ensure proper shape. We are going to seam together the ends to form a tube. Starting with the end of the last row worked, we're going to connect it to the starting chains and row 1. We no longer need the first color since we will be using just the second color. Slip stitch into the first chain/stitch. It will most likely be a tight fit. To avoid tangles, cut the first color, leaving about a 12 to 18 inch tail. Just a side note, I apologize for the wonky color balance in these shots. I had spotty sunlight, but I think the contrasting colors also confused my phone. Back to the second color, chain 1, then work half double slip stitch through both the bottom of the first stitch in row 1 and the third loop of the first stitch in the last row worked. Continue working half double slip stitches to seam together the ends. This continues the second color dominance on the side that is facing up and pushes the first color of row 1 to the other side where that color is dominant. Everything should line up stitch for stitch. The result is not entirely seamless, but it does maintain the color pattern. Now you have to decide which side you want to be the top of your brim. One side is first color dominant and the other is second color dominant. I thought for sure I was going to go with pink for the brim until I got to this point, so I didn't make my first color tail long enough, which is why I told you to cut an 18-inch tail, because you just never know. Pull on both tails, then stretch the seamed row and the rest of the hat to make sure there is no bunching and everything is flat. We're going to cinch the side opposite the brim. I chose the yellow side for the brim, so I'm cinching the pink side. Thread the long tail onto a yarn needle. My tail was too short, so I eventually had to tie in more yarn using a fisherman's knot. Then sew a running stitch around the top of the tube opening. Pull on the yarn to cinch the hat top closed, taking care that you don't pull so hard that it scrunches up the seam. Then sew through the gathers until it is secure and looks nice from both sides. Remember, this beanie is reversible. Then weave in all the ends, which I usually like to use to clean up the seam or any gaps. Because there are two alternating colors, it's hard to make things secure without messing up the distinct color lines. So I wove the colors straight back into each row, and then I added some liquid stitch adhesive to the ends to keep them from coming out. Don't worry, it dries flexible and clear. And that's it! Your ribbed reversible two-tone beanie is complete. For more tutorials and free patterns, visit DeliaCreates.com.